Welcome, I'm Kelly Fitzsimmons Burton. I'm joined by my friends from Faulkner University, and today is the third in a series of conversations we have been having about Rod Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies. Last time we concluded part one of the book, Understanding Soft Totalitarianism, which explained the problem of our times. Today we hope to go through part two, How to Live in Truth, which is Dreher's proposed response to the problem. But before we begin, let's introduce ourselves.
Hi, I'm Melissa Cain Travis, and I'm an assistant professor at Houston Baptist University.
My name is Jeff Kreh. I'm president and co-founder of Likewise College, which brings an associate's level Great Books degree to our incarcerated neighbors.
My name is Zak Schmoll. I'm the managing editor of An Unexpected Journal, a quarterly publication of cultural and imaginative apologetics.
And before we get going, I just wanted to give a little overview of part two, because we probably aren't going to be able to cover everything today. But the topics that are included in part two include valuing nothing more than truth, cultivating cultural memory, families as resistance cells, religion, the bedrock of resistance, standing in solidarity, the gift of suffering, and then again he goes over live not by lies. So we'll start with some questions we've come up with about valuing nothing more than truth. And I think, Jeff, you might want to kick us off on that.
Yeah, and I'm not the only one who had a question on this section, so we'll just jump in on it. I want to start by reading a quote off of page 100. Dreher says, "It is up to us today to take up this challenge, to live not by lies and to speak the truth that defeats evil. How do we do this in a society built on lies? By accepting a life outside the mainstream, courageously defending the truth, and being willing to endure the consequences. These challenges are daunting, but we are blessed with examples from saints who've gone before." And so my question really is quite personal of what are the pressures, or what lies do we hear in culture around us that pressure us the most? And I think it's for me, the question is, what do I feel pressured to accept that either I know or I think I know is a lie? And Melissa, you had a question on this section too, and I think our interests somewhat dovetail.
Yes, so I'll just say a quick word about my part of this specific question, and that is, how do we do this in the context of the church? So Jeff, your question is more about doing this within the context of our current culture, but as much as I'm interested in that, I also really want to know on a practical level, as citizens of the global church, what does this look like when we have some very real inroads made by false ideologies within the church, and people are passionate about those false ideologies. And so I'm wondering, how do we speak the truth in love, but yet tear down the lofty arguments and false ideologies that 2 Corinthians 10:5 talks about?
Yeah, so do we want to start naming them? Because as a philosophy teacher, I face certain questions every single day that I find the heart of the problem. And I would say when I'm engaging the classroom, the secular classroom, the number one problem I face is skepticism. Nobody can really know for sure. And I see a similar problem in the church in the form of fideism. We really can't know. You just have to believe. And those two have been my lifelong challenges, and I think they're both lies.
I think you're 100% spot on with both of those, and I do agree. I think they're very similar problems, manifesting themselves differently. Another set of challenges that I think kind of go hand in hand, at least what I see, is this lie that if I disagree with you, if I say you're wrong, somehow I must hate you or diminish your humanity. And in the church, I think we see that evidenced, maybe not in those same words, but a lot of times, I mean, frankly, we don't know our theology, right? I mean, you have like Barna and, research that comes out that, oh, a significant percentage of the church believes that Jesus is a created being. Or, you know, you see those challenges in the theology. So I wonder, um, and that I think extends also to the concept of love. We don't understand what it truly means to love someone, and sometimes that means, pointing out that they are wrong and they're moving in the wrong direction. So I wonder, um, as a church, to kind of help combat that, cultural lie, if you will, that, oh, you hate someone if you disagree with them. Maybe like a better theology of what love actually means so that we feel firm in our convictions when someone says, oh, you disagree with me, you hate me. You're like, well, no, this is what love is. This is what love means. This is how I'm showing love to you. Like, but we need to be firm in that conviction, or we feel hurt that we hurt someone, you know?
Zach, I
Well, and
think
that's, if I'm your friend and I see that you've got a nail sticking out of your head, and I say, hey, Zach, you've got a nail sticking out of your head, and you say, no, I don't, I'm going to insist that, yes, you do. We need to go get you some help. In that there's nothing judgmental about that. It's observing that there is something that's off and wanting to see what's best for you come out of that. I think that's what Jesus sees when he looks down on humanity and caught in this quagmire that we are not intended to be part of, and yet we've embraced it wholesale. And he's the older brother who does what he's supposed to do and comes and seeks us, finds us in the pig pen, prodigal as we are, and invites us home so that he can negotiate terms with the Father. And we tend to think that because somebody points out something that's amiss, that they're our enemy. But good grief, if I've got a nail sticking out of my head, I want you to tell me.
It's interesting because as you were reading that paragraph, and I hadn't, on 100 there, I hadn't thought of it, when I was reviewing on my own, but hearing you read it this time, he talks about accepting a life outside the mainstream. It's going, and it arguably is, outside the mainstream to tell people those truths, right? It's arguably outside the mainstream now to say something that might upset someone. And so, I mean, yeah, I can't help but think, man. And at the end of that same sentence, he talks about we have to be willing to endure the consequences. So even after we communicate, no, this is what love is. I'm really trying to help you. I promise. Yeah, here's the reasons why this is loving, like you just said. The consequences is they might still hit us, and we have to be willing to live with that, but not compromise the truth.
I couldn't agree more with both of you. And I just want to point out that when we're drawing that line between the mainstream and living outside the mainstream, the line isn't at the threshold of the church door. I'm seeing the line well inside the doors of the American church these days. And so even in our church community life, we're having to deal with kind of trying to walk that fine line of speaking the truth in love. And one of the lies that I am seeing grow rampantly right now in the church community is this idea that above all else, you protect someone's feelings and sensibilities about these hot button issues that we're dealing with in our culture right now. And if that means not being able to tell them the truth, then so be it. And I would call that one of the most insidious lies within the church right now. because we're supposed to speak the truth in love. And sometimes it's going to be offensive, even to a fellow identifying Christian, right? I see that affecting us in our day-to-day lives. As we pursue this life without lies, I see this specific issue as being the one that's really going to impact us the most in terms of how expensive it is and how potentially painful it can be.
Yes. So just to maybe pull this conversation together, going back to the quote, there's 3 parts to this quote. One is living outside the mainstream, and that might even be within the church. 2 is defending the truth. And 3 is enduring the consequences of doing that. And I think this connects later with the chapter on suffering, because he's kind of preparing us. This living by truth is going to lead to kind of suffering.
And that suffering is an apologetic within itself. The willingness to suffer for what we believe is a great demonstration. It's the demonstration in the New Testament. That's why suffering is not something to be ashamed of, but rather we were reading just the other night, kind of pull back the curtain on some tactics that we use. We have read to our children every single night out of the Bible from the time that they were actually with our oldest before he was born. And we were there in Acts where Peter and John, they go to the temple and they pass by the man at the beautiful gate, and they heal him, and he's jumping and leaping and praising God. And you have the people are attracted to that, and the leaders are very against it. And so they put him in jail, and the angel comes and lets him out in the middle of the night, and they're back in the temple preaching again, and they bring them in and they tell them, we commanded you not to preach in this name anymore. And they won't even say the name, not to preach in this name anymore. And it's almost like Luke is channeling Plato with Socrates in the Apology right there in their response to say, we must obey God rather than man. And they flog them, tell them not to do it, and they leave rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer for the name. And Peter talks about, or first or second Peter talks about suffering, and that when we suffer as Christians, suffer for doing the right things, we are identifying with Christ, and he is identifying with us in a very intimate way through that suffering. And so, as uncomfortable and unpleasant and kind of, it seems crazy to want to suffer, but it's in suffering that we are drawn closer and closer and closer to what it means to be like Christ. And so, if you're not having those readings and those discussions with your kids, man, you're missing out, because I know we're planting seeds for something, and these are seeds that we've been given to plant by Christ to ensure that when it comes time for them to suffer, that they are able to suffer with dignity and with the understanding that it's a good thing. It's a Christ-like thing to suffer as a Christian.
Jeff, you reminded me of something that happened. I think we started these conversations 2 months ago, and I bought this book for a young man I've been talking with, and he and I had this conversation about suffering, and we were trying to think about how do you prepare yourself for the kinds of suffering Dreher talked about. And I think you're right. We need to read stories of suffering, and we need to read stories of saints that have gone before, like Fox's Book of Martyrs, and just know that this is something historically that happens, and mentally prepare for that possibility and improbable eventuality, right?
The interesting part about all of this is it ties way back to the beginning of Dreher's book, right? That there's this soft totalitarian state, right? And it's going to come in and kind of make you all comfortable, right? It'll be therapeutic. So this suggestion of suffering is so contrary to everything that our culture tells us all the time that, I'm not going to weigh the relative difficulties of suffering at different times throughout history, but if you're constantly fed a message of your life should be good, your life should be comfortable, you should be financially secure, et cetera, et cetera. It's hard, I think, for a lot of people to break out, right, of this mindset that, no, we have to be okay with the potential consequences if it comes to that. And, how far along that path we are, I suppose that's a separate question. But if it comes to that, like, we have to literally, back to that same quote on page 100, right? It's literally kind of outside the mainstream. It is radically outside the mainstream.
Yeah, I think so. Should we move on to Melissa's question? Or did we cover this one too?
We pretty much covered it, I think.
Yeah, I think maybe we did.
Unless anyone wants to say a little bit more about on a practical level, how do we navigate church life when we're sort of a subset, those of us who really want to call out the falsehoods, and that inevitably is going to cause tensions within the church community. How do we navigate that? I'm really seeking answers to that very question right now.
I think one thing is that we recognize we have the unity of the Spirit with believers, but there's division and we have to work for the unity of the faith. And I think this ties back to his defending truth. So we're kind of a body, and we can't not be a body, but the body is broken and we need to work for healing. And the healing is through coming to agreement on the truth. And that takes a lot of work. It may be our whole life. It may be your children continue it. And I think this is part of the process of how the church comes to greater unity and understanding. But we have to recognize, hey, we are divided, and hey, we're not supposed to be. Jesus prays for the unity of the church. And if he prayed for it, then it's going to happen, but it's only going to happen through us and his grace working through us.
Right. And so do you see, as part of that striving for the unity as a body, do you see calling out ideological falsehood as part of that, even when we have some members of the body who are extremely resistant to having a pet cause or a pet belief called falsehood? I mean, is that part of our pursuit of unity? Is the truth, the truths about human nature and who God is and who we are in society together, are those truths important enough to preserve at the expense of an element of disunity?
I think they are. I think they are. And Scripture says, sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. And so we have to speak the word, the whole full word of God, in love, but we can't pretend there isn't a whole word of God.
That's good.
I would also look at, of course, motivation. I'm not going to question, because I know you well enough through our conversations that your motivation is to see people in a right and reconciled relationship with Christ. And that's first and foremost. But there are some practical tips on process of how to deal with conflict within the church. And, knowing the difference between what Paul does with, or what Paul does with Peter when he calls him out in public, because what Peter had been doing was public. And when Jesus says, go to them privately, and then if that doesn't work, take along some witnesses and try again, and there's a steady increase of the pressure. Of course, now that pressure only works if there's underlying relationship that is at work as well. But study the process on that too, and if I'm in a public setting and somebody says something absolutely heretical and crazy, trying to sway the group, I feel like I have a responsibility in that moment to address it lovingly and challenge it with scripture on the spot. And I'm the preacher who can't tell you book, chapter, and verse, but it's in there. So you read it for yourself. You'll find it somewhere between Genesis and the end of Revelation. But I think the key is being sensitive enough and being grounded in the truth enough that when we sense that there's a definite, not an opinion thing, but a definite disagreement with truth and the will of God, when it's a public situation, we have to call it out publicly, I think. But there are a lot of conversations that there's a lot of conflict that can be dissipated if we'll go first in private and really, one-on-one, it's hard to miss the message. It's hard to miss the heart. But some people do, and then follow that process that Jesus lays out. I mean, good grief, he's brilliant when it comes to conflict resolution. Now, he was not after conflict resolution. Well, ultimately he was, but in the moments where he's calling them vipers and taunting them and poking them in the eye to get them to crucify him, despite the crowds, that was ultimately about conflict resolution too. But for us, he prescribes something a little different.
So we have,
and those conversations are so uncomfortable. Those conversations are so very uncomfortable.
I think it calls for wisdom too, right? And maybe Zach, you had a question somewhere in here about silence. Sometimes telling the truth is by being silent. And I think we just need to have wisdom, know when to speak, know how to speak, know the context, be situationally aware.
Well, and I think fundamentally, and I think, Kelly, you were kind of hitting on this, part of the element is if that person is truly also concerned with pursuing biblical truth, right? So if they are on a shared commitment, I mean, of course, at the end of the day, we might not all agree on our scriptural interpretation, but Melissa, you kind of asked, where do you draw that line? If that person is not concerned with biblical evidence, that may be the line where it's like, okay, I'm sorry, like, it's hard to have this conversation with you because we can't even fundamentally agree that the testimony is important. So maybe as a practical tip, maybe that's more where it really causes, more concern, I suppose.
So I think what we're doing right now is talking about how to live in truth within the body, because that also is a place where there's division and falsehood comes in, and maybe that's our primary place we work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dreher doesn't talk about that very much. So
it's kind of interesting too, because he's moved around a lot in his life from reading his biography and whatnot. So I'm sure he's experienced it before, and it would have been interesting. And he has also transitioned denominations. Yeah. So it would be interesting to hear his thoughts on that, because I would like to hear more on what he has to say.
Yeah. Well, I think perhaps we need to say this is a conversation that has to be ongoing. How to speak the truth within the church in a way that brings greater unity. And it might have to start locally. I mean, it does have to start locally, but it has to continue. I mean, the church is badly divided, and I think that division is what causes a lot of people to leave, and what causes the world to go, nah, you guys don't have your house in order. Why should we join it? So this is our work, I think, as Christians.
And I think I would go even as far as saying that we're facing so much of this within the walls of the church, the metaphorical walls of the church, because of the past decades of anti-intellectualism in the church, and people not being able to think well, think critically, to reason through things through a biblical lens. And it feels as if we're now reaping the consequences of those decades.
Agree. And this goes back to defending the truth. We haven't done that. And I had a conversation with somebody the other day saying that we can't rely on the politicians to fix things. We can't rely on the kingly arm to fix things if the so to speak prophetic and the priestly haven't done their work. The prophetic bringing the word, the priestly working it into the people. So don't rely on politics to fix it. So we do have to go back to the teaching, the teachers, and that's connecting to defending the truth. I think we need to come to terms with that. The church has not been doing that.
Right. And so many people are completely lacking in their discernment when it comes to the ideologies that are encroaching upon us under the guise of, a progressive form of Christianity.
Right. And this takes us back to that idea of progressivism as a religion where there's doctrines, there's ideas. This is really a war of ideas, and we're not engaging it at that level. We're like, oh, we'll just do a culture war or let politics sort it out. We'll vote for somebody else next time. That's not going to fix it. And I think we're coming to see that. No, this is like really, we're in a bad place right now.
Well, and again, that comes from a certain cultural and historical and biblical illiteracy. And how do you talk about a topic that the other side or the other person that you're trying to reach and communicate with has not been exposed to, and doesn't necessarily see the wisdom in exposing themselves to, because they've been told that that's the problem. So why would I expose myself to this problematic ideology? It's too threatening to read the Bible, or it's too threatening to read Cicero, or whatever it is. And then again, the inability to engage in conversation because of a lack of training to engage in conversation, and that being the basis for the relationship, where if we can trust nothing else, we can trust that the person who is speaking to us, again, has our best interest at heart and is an agent operating for our benefit. So it's a huge, hairy, tangled mess. But I think the cultural, historical, and biblical illiteracy continues to grow, and it continues to grow as a product of progressive education. And how do we tackle that? I think we start in our own, again, Zach, like you were saying, and Kelly, you said it too, I think we're all saying it, starts in our own backyard, and making sure that we are doing what we can do, and then discovering as we attempt conversations, either how much work we have to do, or maybe just as likely, how close we are with other people. We just don't know it because we haven't been engaging in conversation.
I think this takes us right into the next chapter, if I can use this as a stepping stone, because, and I don't want to overlook other questions, but you raised this issue of not knowing history and not knowing the Bible. And the next chapter is about cultivating cultural memory. And there is a context. So this chapter about cultivating cultural memory ties into the locations for doing that. And the locations are in the family and in religion or in the church. So those are kind of our back door. And we do have opportunities. I'm not a parent, but I do have my kids, and I do have opportunities with young people. And so I think if we look in our backyard, we do have ways where we can pass on what was taught to us. And we were trained in the great books. We have tools, and I'm sure our training is beyond just Faulkner. I know mine is. But I think forgetting the past is an issue. So I have a question about the quote that Dreher uses as the intro to this chapter, and it's taken from Orwell's 1984, and it says, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And this is really where you see it is a battle of ideas, and it's happening in real time right now. Who controls the past? Are we going to continue telling the story about the West, about Judeo-Christian values, or are we going to erase that or say that that's an oppressive past? Because how we tell that story will determine the future. But I've been talking so much, I'm going to pause and see what others have to say about this quote. What does this mean for us?
I mean, I will point out one thing that he mentioned shortly after on page 112 that, I mean, proves that quote exactly right. In 2019, the survey, meaning it's a survey conducted by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. So the survey found that a startling number of Americans of the post-Cold War generations have favorable views of left-wing radicalism, and only 50%, or 57%, sorry, of millennials believe that the Declaration of Independence offers a better guarantee of freedom and equality than the Communist Manifesto. So that comes back to what Jeff was just saying, that who controls the education? Well, people who might be more favorably inclined and want to teach that the Declaration of Independence is a worse document than the Communist Manifesto. But it's startling. It just proves that point from, I mean, if you're the one in charge of, the curriculum, you can teach the past, and therefore you influence the individual social and political behaviors of future generations, which is what we see.
And this has been going on for really a long time. When I got to college, I realized I don't know anything. I don't know anything about history. I had to teach myself. So I think things probably are worse now for the young people. But we have alternatives here too. And he tells us about that, about classical education and homeschooling. I think a lot of people are going that way. Perhaps those are the people we need to network with or encourage.
I may have said it earlier, if not in one of these conversations, in a side conversation we've had, but up until the time that, and it was Dr. Jewell who forced me to read the primary documents of history, and Dr. Woods in the American documents class, I forget what the name of it was, but up until the time that I actually read the primary documents and I read the founders in their own words and started this exploration of who was influencing them and where were they getting the intellectual and the intellectual tools and the moral courage to do what they did, because it's otherwise unheard of in human history what they did. Where did they get that? And it was in reading those primary documents, not somebody's digested version of them, but reading those primary documents and chewing them over myself, that I went from somebody who absolutely thought that the United States was hugely problematic, that you could have these people claiming to be Christians and rebelling against authority, just blatantly disregarding Romans 13. And then going back and reading primary documents and realizing, no, they, in a very deep way, they were following Romans 13, to the letter, in their resistance of authority that had gone off the rails. And so reading those primary documents converted me from somebody who is very against, and not necessarily sympathetic to Marx, but very against Jefferson and Washington and Adams and the rest, to at least having read them and given them a fair judgment by listening to their personal testimony. And then that, again, that changed my view of them. And I can at least appreciate that they believed and had really solid ground that they were standing on. They believed that they were doing the right thing. And so
Now,
that's another challenge, is read those primary documents.
see, this is where I want to get all practical and say, wow, Jeff, that would be a really great class to offer. I would take it.
Well, maybe that's another channel for another day.
Yeah. Yeah.
This might be a little bit of a sidebar to what we're talking about, but when I read the epigraph quote and then his explanation on page 114 about the distinction between historical, social, and cultural memory, and specifically his definition of social memory, he says, social memory is what a people choose to remember. That is, deciding collectively which facts about past events it believes to be important. So if we think about that in the context of the contemporary conversation such that it is right now, it strikes me that everyone has a very personal stake in the kind of narrative we tell about our society, right? Because depending upon the shape of the narrative, their place in that narrative is different. And we could give all sorts of examples based on religious persuasion, based upon ethnicity, so on and so on and so forth. And so I thought that spoke so deeply to this deep human need to be part of a grand narrative, right? And so we have to remember how very, very important it is to get the narrative right. And any narrative that doesn't correctly characterize human nature, like who we are, where we came from, and where we're going, is going to ultimately be destructive, right?
Right. Yeah, and on the same page, he talks about the erasure of culture. If you don't have a culture, then you don't have an identity. And I think culture is the way that grand narrative is preserved. So if you erase that, then who are we? And I think, as we mentioned last time, this progressive story, it enables people to be part of a story still. So you won't lose your identity. Here's another way to envision yourself. And you can be a hero.
Well, and if you don't know who you are, that's okay. We'll tell you.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think a lot of people could say that, though, right? That's how we first receive the narrative, is we're told. I think that's where some people have rested. I think defending the truth is, here's who you are. We're telling you this, but here's why that's who you are. Now you go and make it your own and defend it if you really believe that's who you are.
And speaking from the progressive viewpoint, if we strip away and we take away the culture and the cultural memory, then whoever does that gets to control the narrative. And that's what Dreher's point is. So for an entire generation that doesn't know what they are supposed to be, when they hear the authority figures telling them, whether it's social justice or critical theory or whatever it is, when they hear that is the truth and that is the ultimate aim for your life, is to be the person who manifests this, I don't even know if it's a counterbalance thing to reality, but when that's what the authority tells those who do not have a connection to the memory, then you just become whatever they tell you to become and think that you're choosing that for yourself. And again, that's where getting back into the primary documents, I think, is so very important. And what we have in the Western canon and in the great books is such an incredible treasure, and should be treasured.
I agree, Jeff. And when I was younger, I maybe this is something all teenagers do, but I wanted to rebel against the authorities. And I feel like probably teenagers still do, right? And the new rebellion is going to be, let's go back to some kind of tradition. Let's go back to, or let's read instead of go on Facebook or whatever young people do these days.
Well,
At least
I'm going to
that's my
say, I'm going to say amen to your desire there, because that would be, God willing, that's the rebellious nature of children, generation to generation. I think it at least keeps the pendulum moving, so we don't end up stuck on repeat with some of these ideas that keep surfacing.
Kelly, just as a fun addendum to this part of the conversation, I wanted to see if you guys saw the connection that I noticed between the quote from 1984 and Dreher's discussion with the Lois Lowry book, The Giver. Have you guys read that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, such a fabulous series, but I could not stop thinking about it through most of this chapter, because for any of our listeners who have not read the book or seen the film, it is through limiting cultural memory that the dystopian society of the story is fully controlled by their governing body. And so there's a figure in the story called the Keeper of Memory, and he is the only one in this society that has access to historical memory. I guess that would be the right Dreher label to use for what he's the keeper of, is the historical memory. And so very much demonstrating that who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past, because you have these almost automaton human beings in this society just living according to the little bit that they know. So I just thought that was a really interesting and fun connection to a novel that's several decades old now. I don't remember what year that came out.
It also strikes me as interesting because, I mean, no spoilers or anything, but being the giver is an overwhelming process, right? When our protagonist is in the process of becoming the giver, it's stressful for him, right? He has a lot of, because there's the really good things, and there's also the really painful and the really bad things. And so, I mean, one thing that struck me when you posted this question, Melissa, is, man, a lot of times, with social media, with the information overload, it's like, whoa, I'm feeling too many things right now, and too many elements of other people's memories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, too much. The overwhelming noise of it all, and that's portrayed really beautifully in the film, I think, where he just is feeling this overwhelming noise and it's crushing.
And maybe it's a call that, we're not designed to bear the weight of the world all the time, right. And yet sometimes we feel like we are. I mean, you see it. I see everyone all upset on Facebook, and it's like, huh, man, now I'm sad too. And it's not that we can't be sad or that's wrong to be sad, but man, I don't know that we're designed to bear the entire weight of the world all the time.
Right. And isn't it also interesting that in Lowry's book, the aim of this governing body of this, what we would call a dystopian society, is really utopianism. Like for them, it's like the ultimate progressive society. They're trying to eliminate all pain. They're trying to have ultimate equity for every human being, and so on and so forth. And so I just think it's so interesting, all the different parallels we could draw between that story and Dreher's warnings.
But the arrogance to be the permanent decider of such things for others. And again, that gets back to an earlier conversation talking about the assumed omniscience of progressive leadership and progressive thought. And that it has to be absolute to work. And that's another thing in The Giver is it is extremely dangerous for this one person to go off the reservation, because that sets precedent. And once you have that, you no longer have control. And again, if the strength of the idea is only able to be realized in absolute control, then any challenge to that shows just how fragile it is and how weak the strength actually is.
Yes.
Well, and isn't it interesting that right in the beginning of the book, what begins to make Jonas realize he's different is he sees color, right? Isn't it the
Yeah.
apple and he sees beauty? So is that something that maybe we could unpack a little bit? Is that one of our answers to this? Is to show that we have a more beautiful way, like all this ugliness, all this chaos. I mean, I think a lot of people are feeling burdened right now and weighed down by, the circumstances around us, and it's really quite ugly in a variety of ways. I mean, man, the Christian way is a beautiful way if we actually applied it.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Zach, this reminds me of something else about living in truth is being in touch with reality. And I think a lot of times reality is beauty, is nature, is the ordinary things. And I want to bring up another book that is kind of a companion to Dreher. It's called Out of the Ashes, Rebuilding American Culture by Anthony Esolen. He talks about this, about how to get in touch with reality. And it's working with your hands, making things, getting dirty in nature. And I think because we're so connected technologically, we forget about that. Like, I have to go outside every day and look at I'm kind of like obsessed with nature around my house, and I look at my cacti and I watch a sunset, and I'm like, this is the world, this is reality. And I think people need to do that.
Yes, yes, yes. You're making me think of my beloved James Schmoll and how much he talked about walking in the world and seeing what is.
Yes, I do that every day, 2 times a day. And I take note of everything because I want to be in touch with reality. So another way to live in truth, get in touch with reality, people. Look at colors. Anyway.
And one thing that's helped me with social media, and this is just another, you're asking about practical things. I missed on my phone. I was going to set up my phone to give me a certain break once a day from 7 to 8 in the evening, that it would just go into like a saver mode and go black and white. Well, I missed, and instead I set it from 8 a.m. to 7 a.m. So 23 hours out of the day for several days in a row, I pick up my phone and look at stuff or whatever. And I found that I was much less interested in social media without all of the color. And so if you just want to try an experiment, get in your phone, look on YouTube, you can put in your type of phone and how to change it to black and white or grayscale, and see if that doesn't kind of take some of the edge off. It's supposed to be better for your eyes too. So
interesting.
That is interesting.
All right, I have one more question. Actually, 2 more in this chapter. I think we probably are going to not finish all of these today, but Dreher implies that cultural memory is a responsibility of the old to the young. And I'm just wondering, I don't think we're old, but one day we might be. I'm wondering, do older people around us feel this responsibility? I do, and I don't think I'm old, but I'm just wondering, is this something older people take on, or have they also bought into this other notion of comfort and individualism? And I'll leave it to somebody else.
I think they should, and I think they should quickly, because there's no telling. If you want to take down a society, take out its wisdom, and we have a lot of older people in this society. And the blessing, when I was studying postmodernism, and I think we're all kind of postmodern, and we're The emerging generation is more postmodern than maybe they think. But we value story. And I'm sorry, there are no people on this planet with better stories than old people, because they lived when, I mean, if you stepped on a rusty nail, I don't know what you did. You poured some honey on it and went on with your day, or whatever it was. You got people jumping off buildings, and my dad has a story of he and a buddy, there were birches near their house, and they would crawl up into the tops of these birches and start them swinging back and forth until they were close enough that they could trade places. And stories about building a little cannon because you read about it in a book or something, shooting a 3 pounds load off in the air and timing it and seeing it land like 15 feet away from a guy in a boat, and he's freaking out or whatever. These really crazy stories that ultimately older people also have a way to tie some kind of wisdom and some kind of advice to. Man, if you're older and you've got great stories, your grandchildren, and probably your children too, and your great-grandchildren, they not only long for those stories because there is a sense of escape into somebody else's life, but what a great way to pass on not just the cultural memory, but some wisdom, and build relationship and build a yearning for these older stories. I think the older generation underestimates just what power it has through relational conversation and storytelling to have an impact on the emerging generation. And whether that happens in the living room, or that happens in the restaurant, or that happens as a series of Wednesday nights, in a church setting, or what it is, I think our older people need to take seriously the power that they have been given in their experience to touch people through story.
I agree with you. And it's interesting because, so I come at this from kind of an interesting perspective. From the age of about 3 onward, my grandmother lived in our house with us. She, long story short, she came to help take care of when my sister was born. And so, I grew up with that very much firsthand, right, with an older generation. And part of me, I'm always grateful for that. And I always think of it, it's a shame that we have a tendency to kind of isolate our older people away. I mean, they go into a nursing home, maybe you visit, and I know some people need that level of care, so I'm not, judging people who have to make that decision in some way. But at the same time, there is a tendency to not be able to access that wisdom and family structures have changed in a way that children don't always care for their parents. And I realize it's not practical in every situation and all that. So before all the haters hit me in the comments, I totally understand. But, there is something we lose when we separate our elderly into communities that are strictly for them. And I mean, even if you visit once a week, it's a whole lot different than my experience of growing up literally with my grandmother in an added-on apartment right next door where you talk to her every day.
Yeah. And I would say that even in a different way, we're doing that by being as transient as we are. So when my husband and I were newlyweds, we left our home state of North Carolina and moved to Texas. And it was decades. So we've been in Texas since 1999. I guess that means we've been here, August will be 22 years. And it has only been probably in the past 2 or 3 years that I've started to realize how being separated from our extended family, and most notably the 2 generations living still above us, that in a way, what would be a good word? It's sort of a deficiency in the richness that we might have had if we had remained in our extended family circle rather than moving. But the culture today is to be transient, to follow the career wherever the career takes you, the education wherever the education takes you, and so forth. And I really got the strong sense from Dreher's book that he's calling us to reconsider that culture and to reconsider the importance of maintaining the closeness with our extended biological family. Not that that's the only kind of family we can have, but that the richness to be found there, and how that could very soon become a necessity, a necessity in terms of hunkering down according to the Benedict option.
That's what I was thinking of, the Benedict option. And I just want to put in another practical thing here, and that's maybe people should consider putting down roots. I don't think we talk about that anymore. I'm going to be part of a community, and my family is going to be part of a community, and that's another way of acting locally. I think he talks about that in the Benedict option.
Mhm.
Zach?
Absolutely. Yeah, he definitely does. And also, I mean, Dreher has a very personal view on this. I have not read this book specifically, but I've read plenty about it. His work, The Little Way of Lucy Lemming, which is about his sister, um, who was dying of cancer in their hometown in Louisiana, and kind of how he, how the community rallies around her. And it, from what I understand in the end, I have not read this book, I've only read about it. It's kind of his reflection on kind of missing that, because he had moved around the country a lot. And again, not that that's necessarily wrong, but he realized there was something lacking that, he almost wanted from that rootedness that his sister seemed to have, and he felt he was missing.
Yeah. And I will tell you that being in a suburb of a large city in Texas, and not being originally from here, and being surrounded by many, many, many peers who also aren't originally from here, and to see over the past 2 decades the people that will move in for a time and then move away, and it has created in me a longing for that rootedness you're talking about, Kelly. And it was interesting. We were just having dinner with friends last night, and they had mentioned to us that some very long-time friends of ours who have lived here somewhere around 15 years, the husband is about to retire, and they're going to move back to be near their extended family in Buffalo, New York. And I felt such a sense of loss when they told me that, because I feel like they are part of my community here. And it was hard for me to see the situation through their eyes, because I'm thinking, you've invested your heart, you've invested your lives here for 15 years. And then you just pull up, retire, and move across the country, and that's the end, right? It makes me so sad. It makes me long for the way things used to be when you grew up in a community. You already had roots. You stayed there for the sake of your roots. And then your children inherited those roots. I just think there's so much beauty in that I didn't appreciate when I was younger.
I agree. And I think partially by circumstance, partially by choice, I never left Phoenix. I wanted to go to Notre Dame and get a PhD in philosophy there, but it didn't happen that way. And it's partly by choice and partly by circumstances, but I'm so glad things worked out the way they are, because I am part of a community, and I very much appreciate that. I'm very conscious of that. I mean, I teach at the community college, and I really think of this is my college, this is my community. And I value that really a lot. And I'm sad that other people maybe can't experience it in the same way. But also people are like, oh, you're from Phoenix, Podunk Community College, so you don't have that status. I don't care about it, but you kind of are like, oh, you just teach at a community college, right? So there's some suffering there too, in a way. Okay, so we're running long here, and we still have a lot of the book. So what do we do, friends?
I'm not shocked we're running along. That seems to be a tendency for us, but I love your next question on the parallel polis.
Oh, that was for you.
I know, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, I think this is a very important concept that has been coming up. And Dreher, I think this is the first time he formally brings it up on page 120 and through 122, this notion of a parallel polis. So my question is, what is it and how does it serve to preserve cultural memory? And I think this is one of Zak's favorite ideas in this book.
Yeah. And it comes, I mean, he's talked about it in the Benedict option. It's been something I've kind of, ever since I found Dreher, which was through the Benedict option, has been something that really stood out to me. The concept, just his formal definition, is, quote, an alternative set of social structures within which social and intellectual life could be lived outside of official approval. The parallel polis was a grassroots attempt to fight back against totalitarianism, which mandated, in Benda's words, the abandonment of reason and learning and the loss of traditions and memory. So it's a lot of what we've obviously been talking about. I mean, this is a huge point to remember, but we've talked a lot today and in prior videos about, okay, what happens if, you know, the totalitarian state imposes on our lives, right? What if this suffering comes to us? And to me, at least, and maybe you all disagree or see it differently than me, it's almost like you need to prepare now and build these structures for what may happen later. So, for example, let's say, hypothetically, let's say my entire social circle was on Twitter. It's not. I don't really like Twitter. But let's say it was, and Twitter decided to ban me, like they have to a lot of people. And then all of a sudden, like, there goes my online community, right? I have no more access to those people. It would be really convenient to me if I have set up in parallel some other way to get in touch with that community. Maybe it's not as convenient as Twitter, but maybe it means I have to BCC 500 people on an email. You know, like maybe it's something annoying like that. But the parallel polis is appealing to me because it's almost like redundancy, right? Like you don't have to render it right now, but you have it so that if you need it, you can put it into action.
So like a social intellectual insurance plan.
And I sell insurance, so that's a perfect parallel.
So I'm starting a community experiment this year. I'm calling it the Cloister, and the idea is to get people together to read important books like this one and to have ongoing conversations. And so that's kind of my little attempt to get started on a parallel polis. And this is completely unrelated, but it kept coming to my mind in relation to this concept. My husband and I love to watch YouTube videos about luxury real estate that's up for sale. So the Sotheby's International channel is really fun for us. And a while back, we saw this YouTube video advertising a property. It was somewhere in upstate New York. And it was a huge family compound that had gone up for sale. And I mean, this was like tens of millions of dollars. It was so luxurious and beautiful. But one of the interesting things that the builders of this compound did was throughout the woods and the mountains and around the lakes, there'd be these little tiny towers, for lack of a better word. You actually had to climb a little staircase to get up into this little tiny house-shaped structure, and they called them intellectual exchange houses. And the purpose of them was that you would meet at one at an appointed time, and you would climb up into this little tower that had a little sitting room, and you would go there to have discussions about specific topics. And they would pick which little intellectual exchange house they were going to meet at that day. And I just thought that was the neatest little concept. And this idea of parallel polis reminded me of that in terms of the imagery, right? This imagery of sequestering ourselves in order to cultivate and preserve something.
I love it. I have a coffee shop for that. And they're still open, so I'm really grateful. All right, so I don't know. I feel like we should sort of tie a lot of this together somehow. So live not by lies means living in truth. Living in truth means we have to cultivate that truth. And primary places to do that are first in the family. And Jeff gave us some examples of what he's doing. I'm sure there's a lot more that you guys are doing with your kids. Religion, he talks about religion as a bedrock of resistance. And I think probably religious people are sort of aware of this, that the church is supposed to be the pillar and ground of the truth. So we talked about the church and the importance of the church. We haven't talked about standing in solidarity, but kind of suffering together, working together, being aware of who you could network with in a way. I think it's different now than it was for the stories in this book. And we did talk about the gift of suffering. Jeff brought that up. Is there anything else we would like to add? The conclusion is live not by lies.
I think one of the greatest contemporary lies is that the past doesn't matter, and we've alluded to this several times about the we've got to rewrite our history, or the quote that we were just talking about on controlling the past. And just as a practical matter, nobody wants to be told that their past doesn't matter. So why would we as a people suggest that anybody's past doesn't matter? Now from a Christian point of view, we accept that, and we are grateful that we're going to get a new name, we're going to have a new identity, and all of this. Christ is going to give us a stone that has our name on it and is only known to him and us, so that all of the negative baggage tied with who we are in this reality is done away with in the eternal scheme of things. And so we're grateful that our past, as far as what's bad about it, is eventually obliterated. But here in the here and now, to suggest that anybody's past doesn't matter seems to me, again, to be extremely arrogant and uncaring, and dangerously ignorant of what we are called to learn from things that have already happened. If we don't learn from things that have already happened, or if we seek to suggest or seek to legislate that things that have already happened happen the wrong way, so we're not going to talk about those anymore, then there is that axiom that we're doomed to repeat, and probably repeat the greatest mistakes of history. Because I don't know about you, but when I'm doing something that I've never done before, it's extremely rare, if ever, that I do it in a way that it's good in any kind of way that gets me anything that I want. And so this idea of just completely divorcing ourselves from the past and putting a stake through the heart of cultural memory is one of that would be a good thing, I think, is one of the greatest lies of progressivism and Marxism and the ultra radical socialism that is kind of the inevitable trajectory of where things will end up, not reined in. And so one of our great defenses is, again, that as close as we can get to a firsthand account, those primary documents, reading that for ourselves, having conversation groups where we talk about those things, the questions that it raises for us, like we've been doing here, that is a response to that great lie that it doesn't matter. There are things in my past that nobody else knows about, but that absolutely matter to me and have been responsible for keeping me out of more trouble than left to my own devices, totally forgetting about the past. I mean, man, I'd be an absolute wreck. And so the past is important, and a great lie is that it's not important. And that leads to ageism, that leads to not respecting our neighbors, not loving our neighbors, whether those are the people, down the street or people 400 years or 4,000 years ago. These are our neighbors in humanity. And to disrespect them is just inviting, I think it's inviting all of the harm that they endured so they could warn us.
Yeah, Jeff, what you're saying made me think of a lot of things, particularly that I think we need to take this, I don't know what, social justice critique seriously when they look at the past and talk about oppression. I mean, yeah, so the past is filled with a lot of bad things. We have to come to terms with those and be honest. But I think we also need to say there is an alternative lens perspective to look at the past through. And I think it's challenge and response. So we, lucky us, fortunate us, we have these challenges and we get to respond to them. We cannot respond to them without knowing the past, because ideas are what generated the problems we have now, and ideas work themselves out in a kind of logical way. And if we could understand that progression of ideas, we can say, okay, I see how we got here and I see how we can fix it. But that takes a lot of people thinking seriously about the problem. And I think this goes back to, it's uncomfortable, and comfort is what we need. And that's hard work. It's hard work, and it doesn't pay well, and it's not popular. So let's let some other generation do it. And there's going to be generations that don't have the cultural memory or the historic memory or the social memory. So again, I think this is something we have to face now, us, in this discussion.
To very quickly channel, I'm going to go ahead and assume all of us have had Dr. Linville and that he's one of our favorite people on the planet.
Of course.
But to go ahead and to channel Mark Linville, he didn't say this, but he made this comparison. I love it. Comfort is the new orthodoxy, and we have to be willing to be heretics.
Amen. Yeah, comfort is overrated, as I tell my young people. And money's overrated too, guys. I'm sorry, but it is. It goes away. You get it and it's gone. So let's do the hard work. It's rewarding. Okay, wait. Let's talk about the reward of the hard work, because I think that's what's missing here. What did we get out of doing this together?
Well,
I'm not in it alone.
That's exactly what I was about to say. A profound sense of having connected community with people who get it, who don't want to live by lies, who want to pursue the truth, and who want to do so in a godly way, in a biblical way.
And I think another thing that I especially appreciated is, I mean, these are very long, drawn out conversations. Obviously, they're not easy to have. They're the type of conversation that you can't just put on Twitter and have an answer. And unfortunately, as I see, our culture and our attention span shrink ever more, to be able to have a group of people who we can kind of sustain this over, I mean, like you said, Kelly, it's been over a month since we've done our last one, but even in between videos, we've been talking about this privately too. I mean, this has been a long, kind of constant conversation, and it's really been great to be able to, kind of enjoy working with all of you and kind of having the, I don't know, like you guys said, we're not in it alone. That's part of it. And part of it is just being able to, I mean, these questions have lasted millennia, and hopefully they'll last millennia more. So I'm glad that, we had to join in that for a little while and had some fun doing it.
I agree. And I'm hoping that we are, I don't know, at the beginning of creating a little parallel polis. that others would maybe want to join in, and we can expand the conversation. I just love thinking, and I love ideas, and I can't do it all by myself. I need others to counter, to say, well, what about this? Have you thought about this? And so I really appreciate it. And it's a kind of friendship. And I think Socrates, well, all those Greeks thought friendship was the hardest relationship to attain and sustain. So I think it's rare and it's good. And I'm grateful for you all.
And I'd say I feel, as a result of this time that we've had together over these 3 sessions, I just feel more human. I feel humanized by this kind of activity.
Yeah, I had to break away from all the craziness happening to focus on this. And I just thought, oh, this is so much better. It is humanizing. This is the real stuff. Twitter's not the real stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Well, and again, it's all that noise, and being able to the gift of being able to focus for an extended period of time in a conversation with a few people that we count friends, and not in the sense of Facebook friends. I'm reminded just very quickly, Cicero wrote on friendship, and there are hallmarks of friendship. We think about great friends through history, and there are only maybe half a dozen pairings of truly great friendships that we see throughout history. And it's about being open. It's about being willing to risk. These are unscripted conversations, and so to say what we say and to find a sympathetic harmony, a resonance with each other and what we're saying as friendship, and that ultimate expression of friendship. And I think this is where we want to point people always, is when Jesus says friends. Then he says, I call you friends because I'm telling you everything I'm doing. I'm not holding anything back. There in John 13. And the idea that we can be open when people are curating their lives through Facebook and only always putting the best foot forward. And it's a false self, it's a lie. And that we can come together, and some of our conversations off screen are a bit more transparent than our conversations on screen as far as the things that we're dealing with. But to have people to do that with, again, it's just such a huge gift. And I think y'all, and Kelly, I thank you for putting this together, but I thank y'all for great conversations and a reminder of the friendship and the relationship that is developed only through conversation. And again, I'm just grateful that God saw fit to bring us together in our circumstance while we were pursuing something academic, and has given us so much more.
I think that's a good place to end for now. So thank you all, and perhaps you'll see us again in the future. Who knows, right?